Do I know Luke made Luke, John made John, Matthew made Matthew, and Mark made Matthew? How do I know?
How do we know who the authors of the New Testament documents are?
This is a very good question. A lot of people don't understand why Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John have become attributed to the Gospels that bear their name. My guess is that Frank Turek is not going to be giving good information on this particular question. He's definitely a Christian apologist looking to push a Christian narrative about the Gospels, namely that these are eyewitness accounts that really tell the story about Jesus in an accurate fashion, despite the fact that all of the Gospels contradict each other and really only get the main skeletal story correct. So if you want to fuck around and find out how bad Frank Turek fucks up this question, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Frank Turek attempting to answer a question about who wrote the Gospels. Obviously, Frank Turek is going to be pushing the narrative that these Gospels are eyewitness accounts that are written by their title authors. It is important to note before we begin that the Gospels are indeed anonymous. Now, what does that mean? Because obviously they have authors attached to the titles, right? Technically, no. If you'll notice, it's not like the Gospel of Mark, and this was written by Mark in some kind of fashion. This is the Gospel according to Mark. So the actual person that is writing these things down or writing these Gospels is still anonymous even if you go with the titles, because the titles just say, oh, this is what this eyewitness said. But we also know that it can't be the Gospel according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. These are just ad hoc names that are stapled on to these particular Gospel accounts. And we know this because within the Gospels themselves, they never say where this information comes from other than the scriptures and visions from Jesus. At no point in the Gospel of Mark does the Gospel of Mark say that this information comes from Mark. And the same could be said for the other Gospels. But the original Gospels did not actually have titles. In fact, there's only meant to be one gospel of Jesus. Now, the first gospel written, which we would call the Gospel according to Mark, was then later redacted and copied from in order to rework the gospel and provide a more accurate view of what happened to Jesus, supposedly. And this happened 3 times in the early 1st century that is canonical to the Christian faith. We actually don't get any kind of indication of authorship for these Gospels until Papias in the 2nd century. And there's no way that he could have known who actually wrote these Gospels, considering they were starting to be written in the 70s. One way that we know that Papias is more than likely just pulling names out of his ass or making them up is that he seems to think that there is a Hebrew version of Matthew roaming around out there that then got translated into Greek. What we know now is that Matthew was originally written in Greek because that's what Mark was written in. Now, that's not the entire case against Papias, but basically with Papias, he doesn't cite any kind of references to anyone that might be able to give us accurate authors for these Gospels. He just sort of says that this is who it's from. And this amounts to speculation. And speculation from somebody like Papias, who is known to be wrong about a lot of things and spin hearsay into facts, we probably shouldn't trust his just speculative assertion that these are the people that wrote the Gospels. This isn't my opinion about this. This is actually Bart Ehrman's opinion about this. In any event, Papias does not seem to provide us with the kind of information we can place a lot of confidence in. I should point out in this connection that scholars have almost uniformly rejected just about everything else that Papias is recorded to have said in the surviving references to his works. In addition to this sentiment about Papias, Dr. Bart Ehrman also has this to say about the anonymity of the Gospels.
The striking thing about it is that, of course, none of the Gospels themselves claims to be written by any of those people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They're all anonymous. The authors never mention what their names are. And another interesting thing is that when they get quoted early on, they're never named. For example, in none of the Apostolic Fathers First Clement, Ignatius, the Didache, Polycarp, etc. Are these books ever named by apostolic names or even said to be writings by apostles? You mentioned Justin Martyr, but the striking thing of Justin Martyr, of course, is that he quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke extensively, but never says that they're written by Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and never mentions John either. The only gospel he names by name is the Gospel of Peter. The first time that you have anybody of record talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, our books that we are sure are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is writing around the year 185. So even by standard traditional critical datings of the Gospels, this is about 100 years after the Gospels were in circulation. At about the same time, this fragment you mentioned, the Muratorian fragment, I think it's also around the year 180, 185. I think it, like Irenaeus, is closely connected with Rome. And it also mentions by name Luke and John, and it appears to know Matthew and Mark. So what this means is that we don't have early extensive references to these books were being written by apostles. The first time anybody mentions it is 100 years afterwards.
As much as I disagree with Dr. Bart Ehrman on a number of things, I feel like he's got a logically sound case against the authorship of the Gospels. All right, so let's hear what Frank Turek has for this question.
Because the best evidence we have from antiquity is they are the writers of those documents. And even if they aren't, we know that there are, and I'm looking for a slide here, we know that they were certainly written by Jews in the first century. Like, for example, if you read the Gospel of Matthew.
Before we get to this, the Gospels were definitely not written by Jews in the first century, because by the 70s AD, Jews that would have written them would be Jewish Christians at the very least, and at the most, full-on Christian. So it wasn't Jews that were writing these things. They were Christians that were writing these things. And considering that Paul considered himself a Christian or a brother of the Lord or a follower of Christ, however that title was in the first century, considering that Paul was a Christian and he was talking about the theology of Christ, those that were working to provide these little missionary handbooks like the Gospel of Mark kind of is, they were definitely Christian at that point. They were not Jews. And also considering that at that time, it was a rather special skill set to be able to both speak and write in Greek. So these authors that were writing the Gospels had to attend pagan schools to learn how to write in Greek. Now, what does that mean? That means that only a small number of people could have written these Gospels. But more importantly, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, all of those people, they were definitely not in that group of people. So there's no way that they could have written the Gospels. They were poor peasant folk. That's the entire point of them being from the lower class. It factors in with Jesus's whole message of the least shall be first. Really, it's the Bible's whole message of the least shall be first, because you see, these people that were in the lower class, the least of society, that is regularly who God chose in order to make grand pronouncements and display his glory. Giggity. So it makes sense that God or Jesus would have chosen from that particular group of people. But that also hurts the whole narrative, because that group of people simply didn't have the resources or the ability to attend pagan schools in which they learned how to write in Greek. Now, of course, Paul, coming later, but also being a very well-educated Jew, he would have been able to go to these pagan schools, and so he was able to write in Greek. My point is that the title authors of the Gospels simply cannot be the actual authors of the Gospels, considering the place in society and their class and how much ability they had to actually learn how to write in Greek. More to the point of anonymity, though, there is one particular claim that there are a lot of anonymous works that we consider to be written by somebody, and they're similar to the Gospels, so therefore we should trust the title authors because other works were done in the same fashion. This is not true, and I've covered this before with Mike Licona. There are truly anonymous works. There are works that are falsely attributed to one author, but more importantly, as far as the Gospels go, they are literally anonymous, and they do not match up with other historical works at the time. Other historical works at the time normally name their authors, or the authors take an active role in whatever thing they're writing. The Gospels don't have this. They're writing a narrative where they do not speak as though they are the author. They speak from sort of an ominous third-person position that can see everything, like, from God, I guess. So there's no way to tell who actually wrote the book. This is a far cry from other ancient writings at the time that name their authors either in the works or in the titles.
Take a look at this. The best evidence we have regarding the Gospels is that these early church fathers right here, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, this fragment that was written in about 170 AD, Justin Martyr, and Papias, all of these people confirm that the writers that we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote those documents.
Well, see, I have to disagree here, because what you're talking about are just basically Christian church fathers that are regurgitating what Papias is saying. Because Papias, being the early account attributing these works to these authors, I feel like that is the source for actually naming these gospels, or at least being able to sort out the different gospels, because everybody that comes after Papias would have at least known about Papias attaching these names to these works. Considering earlier how we talked about Papias not exactly being trustworthy and how he used hearsay as facts, I think that unless we can find some kind of reference by Papias that actually asserts that this came from somewhere else other than the mysterious Elder John that is more than likely made up, I don't think that we should trust Papias. As soon as we get rid of Papias, everything else crumbles, because everything else is too late in order to verify anything about the Gospels, let alone the authorship. So no, 2nd century sources that claim that they know who authored the Gospels is not evidence of who authored the Gospels. It's just speculation that's been pulled out of the ass of some church father in the 2nd century. Whether that be Papias or somebody else, they just pulled it out of their ass.
Secondly, there's only one human link separating John from Irenaeus. That's Polycarp. So this is very close to John.
In the grand scheme of things, is that close to John? Yes. But there is a key assumption here in that apparently Polycarp studied under the Apostle John, and this is a common claim from people arguing for some kind of connection between these later Christian fathers and the apostles, or rather, I guess they would say disciples. But the important thing here is that Polycarp never claims to have seen, met, or done anything with the apostle or disciple John. Irenaeus claims that Polycarp said these things, but we don't have any actual texts that have Polycarp claiming to have studied under an apostle or disciple John. Again, this is a Christian church father, Irenaeus, just speculating shit out of his ass and telling us that, oh, this originates from one of the disciples, when in reality, we don't have that. All we have is some old guy who's speculating that his teacher actually studied under John. No real concrete connection there.
Claims are from every quarter of the Roman Empire that these were the writers of these documents.
This is an incredibly vague point here. This is in stark contrast to everything that he said up until this point, because he's got very specific names for like people and time frames and all this other stuff. And then we get this really vague statement about how claims were coming from every corner of the Roman world that these people wrote these documents. And it's like, well, yeah, because Papias, one of the early church fathers, started claiming this shit, and so that became the narrative in the Christian church. I can't really do anything with a vague bullet point that doesn't give us any kind of specific information. And I think that if anybody confronts you with just vague statements like this, it should be written off until you can get more specific information. Who was saying this from all the corners? Like, do you have 4 different people from different walks of life that have no interaction with the Christian church whatsoever that are saying these things? Who are you talking about? These are the questions that you need to be asking whenever somebody confronts you with this kind of shit.
There's no rival claims about authorship.
Okay, so the fuck what? no rival claims about the authorship? Well, there would still be no rival claims of authorship if it was done anonymously. But even if there were rival claims of authorship, how is that going to prove anything? Like, how does that prove that they were anonymous? How does the lack of rival claims of authorship prove that they're not anonymous? You have a number of books in the New Testament canon that are written by people that are claiming to be somebody else. Like, you got the pastoral epistles. Those were written by somebody completely different than Paul, but yet they claim to be written by Paul. And if you don't know what the pastoral epistles are, that's 1st and 2nd Timothy, as well as Titus. And then you have the books of Peter that were not written by Peter. And then you've got 1, 2, and 3 John that were not written by John. So don't give me this shit about there's no rival claims of authorship. Why should we expect that?
And they're unlikely invention, these names. Like Luke is not a big name, right? He's not even an eyewitness. Why wouldn't you say, or Mark isn't even a big name. Why wouldn't you say it's the Gospel of Peter rather than the Gospel of Mark? I mean, if you want to get people to believe something that isn't true, you would say Peter wrote the Gospel, not Mark. In fact, there's a Gospel written 100 years after Peter was dead called the Gospel of Peter. And we know it wasn't written by Peter, but somebody put Peter's name on it to get the New Testament believers to try and think it was a true document from Peter, but we know it's written 100 years after he's dead.
Well, it's kind of funny that he mentions this because the books in the Bible that are supposedly written by Peter are not actually written by Peter. They're written by who the fuck knows? Nobody knows, because somebody falsely attributed those books to Peter. But we know that they weren't written by Peter because they were written well after Peter was dead as well. We don't even know if Peter could fucking write. There are some people out there that want to cast doubt on whether or not Paul actually wrote any of the epistles that are attributed to him. We know that there are a few that are not written by Paul, but there are at least 7 letters that are written by the same person that calls himself Paul. And that's really the best that we can do with that. Does it matter if the real Paul wrote those letters? I don't really know. I don't really care. What I care about is that the same person wrote those 7 letters, and those 7 letters made it into the Bible, and that's what we have to work with. The other letters successfully, I guess, impersonated Paul, at least enough to get into the canon. As to why would they speculate about these people? Well, I feel like this particular argument works against Frank Turek here, considering that one of the biggest themes in the Bible in general is that the least shall be first, or that God chooses from the least among his chosen people in order to really accentuate his glory, or how much of an active role he has in the events that are playing out. So if John Mark were to have really written the gospel according to Mark, then it just plays into that particular theme of the Bible. So we should expect people like that to be writing these things or to be the source for these things. It could also be that Papias chose these names because nobody would have thought, oh, he didn't write these things because of this reason. There wasn't really a lot written about the disciples in general, or the apostles really, but these particular obscure people, nobody's going to really know anything about if they were even real people. So picking obscure characters to do your work for you is actually a really good tactic. But regardless of that, this is a whataboutism. He's just simply saying, well, what about Peter? Why didn't they have Peter write this? It's like, well, I don't fucking know. But what we do have, is, as far as hard evidence goes, is the fact that the Gospels do not name their authors. The titles of the Gospels were later tacked on to the Gospels, most likely by Papias or maybe some other early church father that identified them that way. It doesn't really matter who did it. What we know is that they originally circulated without the titles, and they were later given titles by somebody who was just pulling shit out of their ass.
So It's not a very likely invention to name a gospel after Mark, who's a minor character in the book of Acts.
Why exactly is that a mark of authenticity for it? Like him being a minor character, like why would that seem to indicate a more reliable like claim to authorship? This part right here, Frank just sort of speculates about, speculating that, oh, because it was a minor character, that means that he actually wrote it, because nobody would make it up that he wrote it. Why not? Why would that be a crazy thing? It seems to work with Christian theology. It seems to work with the themes of the Bible to have that particular type of individual write these books, the type of individual that would not be able to actually write these books, but God gave him the ability to write the books, or he somehow was able to write these books because it accentuates the power of God and the role that God has in these events. All of this works within the context of Christian theology. Frank is going to need to do a lot more heavy lifting than just, who would have made this shit up? I don't know.
It doesn't make any sense when you could say Peter wrote it, right? Also, there are no documents that have ever been discovered, I should say no manuscripts ever discovered, where we have the title page that didn't say, this is the gospel according to Matthew, this is the gospel according to Luke, this is the gospel according to John, or Mark.
Ironically, we don't have any manuscript evidence that says that they were originally titled that way. We don't have the original manuscripts. We don't know how they originally were circulated. What we do know is that Papias talks about who wrote the Gospels, but he gets key facts wrong about his particular version of the Gospels. Like what I mentioned before with Matthew, Papias thought that there's like a Hebrew version that was going around at the time that was written prior to the Greek version. But what we know is that the Greek version was the first version that was written, not the other way around. And how we know this is that there are a lot of Greek phrases and constructions in the Gospel of Matthew that would not translate well or would not, or would be easily noticed if they were translated from Hebrew. And there's a number of Hebrew phrases that wouldn't necessarily translate into Greek all that well. And so that would be noticeable. And what we find is that we don't have that. We don't have any, well, for one thing, we don't have any manuscript evidence of an earlier Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. But what we do have in the earliest version of Matthew is a Greek manuscript. So Papias is most likely just making stuff up. He's just attaching names that he thinks fits to each gospel, and that has become who the gospel is according to. But we don't have any evidence whatsoever that they originally circulated with titles, and for Papias to make mistakes like he does, it seems to indicate that they originally did not have any titles attached to them. I also want to point out how Frank Turek seems to be using an illogical argument from silence here. That because we don't have manuscripts where the titles are all mixed up, or titles have different names on them or something like that, or we have manuscripts, the original manuscripts that don't have any titles on them whatsoever. He's basically saying, oh, we don't have these things, so therefore they always had titles. He's just using an illogical argument from silence here. And it's illogical because we can't conclude from the evidence given that they always had titles. In fact, the evidence points in the other direction that they did not.
So the idea that these were all anonymous is really mythological. They're not anonymous.
No, it's not mythological. It's just following the evidence and thinking critically about what Frank Turek is saying is evidence. No, it's not mythological because it's just literally following the evidence where it leads. And it leads away from the conclusion that they originally had titles attributed to the people that they are now attributed to. It leads in the direction of these gospels being titleless, and that each gospel was meant to be the Christian gospel.
This is the best evidence that we have that these gentlemen wrote these documents.
Oh, okay, Frank. Well, that's pretty shit evidence right there. And you're actually twisting information in order to even get in that direction. If you just look at the evidence without a Christian lens and you see what the evidence is, you would know that the Gospels were originally without titles and that makes the Gospels anonymous. In the purest sense of the idea, fucking anonymous. Well, heathens, it's going to be all for Frank Turek's video today. All in all, I was just not impressed with his points. They got vaguer and vaguer as he went on. It's almost like after the first 2 points, he kind of just got lazy and just started writing shit down, making up reasons because he needed to fill the screen up with words. And I feel like phoning in your evidence like that should always be questioned. The first 2, I actually respect a little bit just because he has specific names and dates and everything like that. They're totally fucking wrong about what the conclusion that they actually lead to. At least he had those things in it instead of speculative and vague statements that he bulleted later. I can't believe people are convinced by this kind of argumentation that this person in the audience that asked this question is going to walk away like, oh yeah, definitely. Who would have fucking wrote this kind of shit if it wasn't Mark? Obvious. I wouldn't make up something by Mark. That guy's a dipshit. Fuck Mark. That guy's going to walk away with that kind of sentiment right now. Just really bad argumentation for the authorship of the gospel. But like Frank said, this is the best evidence that they have for the authorship of the gospels. Now, my question to you is, how is it that this is the best evidence for the authorship of the Gospels? How do you get to eyewitness testimony from this? Even if the titles were there the entire time, it's the gospel according to this person. And they never report anything that could be really considered eyewitness information. They have ominous portions of the gospel accounts where nobody is around. Like Jesus in the fucking wilderness. He's out in the middle of the goddamn desert or wherever in the fuck at that time. Nobody's around except Satan and probably wild animals. Who's there to relay this kind of information? Now, Frank Turek would tell you that, oh, Jesus came back and told a campfire story about it. But we don't have that anywhere in the Gospels. We don't have any kind of record of that happening anywhere. So it's really just baseless speculation that he's ad hoc tacking on to the story. Needless to say, this video pissed me off a little bit, but it's a really bad video, and it is not the way that you should go about analyzing the evidence for the Gospels. So anyways, if you will, please go down below into the comments and let me know what you thought about Frank Turek and his bulleted points for why the Gospels are not anonymous. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.